Hi, welcome to Metal Mastermind. I'm your host, Ken Candelas, and today we're going to talk about studio design. Now, I know a lot of you out there are self-made musicians trying to do everything on your own. Independent music has been on the rise for the past, I would say, 2 decades, even probably a little longer than that. But along with making independent music means you're going to have to do things on your own as well, just like building a studio. Because now all of this technology has become a lot more accessible, but really building a recording studio is going to be much more than just getting, an interface and a microphone. It requires careful planning, technical knowledge, and an understanding of some acoustics. So we're going to go and dive into that kind of subject today because I think it's going to be really, really helpful for you. So let's talk about the importance of a well-designed studio. A great studio space is critical for achieving the best sound quality and boosting your creativity. I mean, if you really think about it, that space is going to be where you spend all of your time trying to create your best work. And that's what we want. We want our best work to be representative of us, don't we not? So when you have a space, not only does it need to sound good, but it needs to look good and feel inspiring as well. Assessing your space kind of is a little bit of a thought process here, but first you have to just understand, what is the studio for, right? Are you doing this for music production? Mixing, mastering? Are you going to do some sound design, post-production? Are you wanting to be a content creator more than you want to be, let's say, a musician? What are the demands that you need for your studio? And let me tell you, if you want all of it, just be patient with yourself. That's going to take time. So understand the room you have, really. At the bare bones, what's the size of the room? What kind of acoustical problems are you going to have, right? If you have a 10 by 10 room, you're going to have a lot of acoustic problems because there's nodes hitting all over the place with a square. I mean, these kinds of things that if you don't address in the very beginning, they become problematic over the course of time, and it makes working in your space a lot harder, right? So you're going to have these different functions in your studio, and we want to make sure that we set goals in order to tackle those issues. So define the vision of what it is that you want first. Make sure that this is my ultimate goal with doing the studio. I mean, it might be recording, but to what extent? Are you trying to record just guitar, bass? Are you trying to record drums? Is it just going to be vocals? Is it going to be vocals and guitar? What kind of things do you want to have in your studio that's available? Planning and budgeting your vision really starts as simple as just have a sketch. Take a rough design of the space that you have. Think about the equipment, the furniture, maybe the workflow that you have that you want to execute. And set a budget according to what you have your needs. That's a monthly budget that you're giving yourself, that you're allocating for yourself in order to create your studio. Okay? That's a big part of the reason where I find a lot of my students, when they are talking about building a studio, they're like, well, studios cost a lot of money. Yeah, they do, but you don't have to upfront all of that right now. You can do it over time, right? So that's a really big mental block that I want you to, get over, because setting your budget just means, hey, you have to have a little bit of discipline to save a little bit of money to make it happen. Yes, but it can be doable. Right? So building a studio can get expensive, but it's about investing in quality and functionality overall. We want to make sure that the purchases that we make are going to be, one, the essentials, right? Like acoustic treatment, sound isolation, some of the essential equipment. Maybe it might be things like, for example, storage for your data. Normally with acoustics, we want to sort of avoid square rooms. We usually do rectangular rooms because that reduces some of the standing waves and acoustic problems that happen in those spaces. But, when you consider that, also define what's the efficiency to your workflow? Where do you keep your desk? in relation to your equipment or your speakers? Or is the recording space going to be in a separate room, or is it going to be in the same room? One of the things that you want to really prioritize is making things as easy as possible so that it eliminates the resistance to creativity, because that's a huge barrier to people doing the thing that they need to do. They know they have to do it, but they know they also have a lot of setup to make it happen, and that's just not as practical. If you're going to make it a place where you create stuff, you have to make the most optimal choice of where your speakers are, and usually that's going to be like 5 feet from the walls at least, if you can help it, and then have a lot of that space really in the middle of the room dedicated to the mixing position. And the more you back up things against the wall, you're going to have more bass boost issues and all this kind of stuff because of acoustic pressure and how it builds up in corners. So the ideal position is to be in the middle of the room for your mixing position, and then you have an equilateral triangle with the listener for the optimal sound. Recording versus the control room is also another interesting point. So separate the spaces for recording and mixing for better acoustics and isolation is sort of the de facto, yes, we have a studio. Sometimes that's not always the case, though. If you have a space where it's not necessarily even a shared space, you might have a dedicated studio space, but the studio space has to be shared with the recording space versus the mixing space. That's a very common thing too, because hey, maybe you only have so many rooms to dedicate to a studio. Very realistic situation. So if you're going to do that, sometimes I've seen things where people, they'll separate things with like maybe a curtain, or they'll have baffles. That kind of separation, though, if you have the ability to have the separation, then you can really execute this in a way where I can listen to the entire full frequency range, but also feel it because I'm listening on speakers. That's a huge difference between headphones and speakers. So now let's talk about electrics, because the electricity side of the studio might not be something that you have never really considered before. But the idea of setting up electricity for a dedicated space like a studio actually has a lot of benefits. One, for example, you have isolated circuits to avoid interference from other devices. So like your kitchen to your speakers, there's not going to be a ground loop for that kind of stuff. Actually, in the audio world, we define these as sort of tech power and auxiliary power. Tech power being for the thing for your studio, aux power being for like refrigerators, air conditioners, etc., anything else, right? So if you have isolated circuits, and better yet, like if it was already built into your place that way, great. If you want to actually build that into your place, you can totally do that. Of course, I would very much consider, talking to an electrician to do that. But, actually in Metal Studio Designer, the course that I created for this very purpose, we actually talk a little bit about how to understand electricity in more detail. But having isolated circuits allows you to have cleaner audio, better, grounding for all of your devices. It'll last a lot longer in the long run, and you'll have more dynamic range out of all of your equipment, especially things like power amps and speakers. Now, if you're going to have, of course, a studio, you want to make sure everything is going to be nice and cool. You don't want things to get too hot, especially because it can interfere with how your equipment performs, especially if you like analog stuff. You're going to need to get some cooling so that all of that can handle it without, going kaput. When it comes to air conditioning, though, you might also have to think about how you do air conditioning with things like window air conditioners, or you might get ductless vents. You might even decide that you have a central air unit. If you live in a place like probably Florida, places like those are going to have most of the time built-in air conditioning for the entire home. But if you live in a place like New York, where it's like a lot of apartment buildings, there's not a lot of central air. You have mostly window air units. So you're going to have to debate what's going to be more beneficial to you, what's in your price range, and when do you utilize those things. One thing is for certain is temperature control, right? That's we definitely need to have. We need temperature control so that we maintain a stable temperature to protect the equipment and make it comfortable. How do you do that? There's a unit of measurement that you should understand. It's called BTUs, okay? It's British Thermal Units. Now, British Thermal Units is basically how much is converted into heat from excess, let's say, wattage. So you could actually take the amount of watts that your unit creates, multiply that by 3.41, and you actually get the BTU associated for the space. Look at that. So there's a little bit of a tidbit for you on electricity there and how it relates to heat. Because what is heat really other than just unused electricity for most applications of equipment? We have to talk about isolation, right? So how do you get more isolation? Because acoustic isolation is not the same as acoustic treatment, okay? Treatment is how do you contour the sound inside the room. Acoustic isolation or soundproofing is how do you prevent from the outside getting to the inside or vice versa, from the inside getting to the outside, okay? So if you soundproof the room, you're going to keep all that external noise out and you're going to prevent your recordings from leaking to the outside world. We want to make sure that we do that if we can. You know, sometimes I understand it's not as practical depending on where you live. But if you have, let's say, an unfinished basement available to you, this might be an opportunity that when you build your studio, don't just start building out right away without doing something like this foundational construction. So you could do things like double walls or double windows. Like those are going to help block out sound by having a space of air in between those boundaries. When you have air, by the way, is one of the greatest isolators for sound and electricity, by the way. So if you have air, that means it's going to be more resistance that once the sound hits the wall, right? It transmits, it refracts through the wall, but now there's air that it has to push in order for it to get to then the next wall. Okay? You understand how, like, this kinetic energy that it's moving through, it's going to have a tough time because now there's multiple layers of resistance, right? And air is a very big one. So don't disavow. This is what we call a floating room for most things, right? Where you have a raised floor, the double walls. You also have a lowered ceiling from what was already the bulkhead of the building. These kinds of constructions help to give more isolation in the studio. Now, acoustic treatment inside the studio can be very, very fun. This is where you can get a little bit more colorful, a little bit more strategic with your placement, right? You can get foam panels, you can get, bass traps, you can get, fiberglass panels. I mean, there's so many different ways to do it. The one thing I would just urge you to think about is if you go foam is cheaper and you can get more of it, but foam can really only address certain frequencies as well as, depending the size of the foam. When it comes to fiberglass is generally more all around, very flat in how it absorbs most frequencies. So if you get foam, know that you, for example, might skew absorbing more high frequencies than you do low frequencies, versus if you get fiberglass, it will absorb high frequencies and low frequencies a little more evenly. Bass traps, really all it is, it's any of those materials, foam or fiberglass, but they're placed in the corners in a way for air to be trapped. If you think about what is a trap, essentially when air hits the panel, a little bit of that air reflects back depending on how stiff the board is, but most of that's going to go through. It's porous, right? It's going to go through, and by the time it gets through, it's going to be a lot weaker on the other side. And when it's weaker on the other side, just like we were talking about with the walls in between, right? That air helps to keep that pressure locked in because it's going to be so weak that when it hits the wall on the other side and tries to reflect back, it's not going to be strong enough to go through that porous material again because it's just dense enough to keep it locked in there. So that's what a trap is, and that's how it kind of works. And it helps to reduce the sound reflections around your room and reduce that reverb
time. We go over that kind of stuff in Metal Studio Designer as well, so you'll know exactly which materials you need in order to build your dream studio.
If this is something that you're really interested in, you can get more in-depth guidance on studio design. Blueprinting your perfect studio is a great part of this process with Metal Studio Designer. We've got this awesome program. It's called the Inner Circle of Metal Mastermind, where you can have full access to the course and an entire resource on advanced acoustics and basic acoustics, studio preparation. You get all these ebooks
to help you navigate this so that you don't have to feel lost. So if that's something that interests you, head on over to metalmastermind.com. And if you want to join the Inner Circle, that is metalmastermind.com/the-inner-circle. And don't forget to, of course, like, comment, subscribe. Please comment and let me know if you felt this video was helpful to you, and if you've actually done your own studio. I want to hear from you. That's what Metal Mastermind is about. We're here to educate the next generation of metal musicians. That being said, love you all. See you in the next video, and don't forget, create your own sound.